Hey everyone, and welcome to this video in which I am going to nerd the fuck out about my top 10 metalcore releases of 2022. So if you're into that shit, stick around and let's just start with number 10. On number 10 we have Vane FM's This World Is Going to Ruin You, an album which I actually found pretty disappointing for the majority of the year. It's the follow-up to their 2018 album Zone, which is, in my opinion, one of the very best metalcore records of all time. It was produced by Will Putney, who is probably the best metalcore producer at the moment, and it was preceded by 3 amazing singles. So, needless to say, my expectations were sky high coming into this record. Probably too high, because the final album left me quite underwhelmed. Despite loving the overall Deftones White Pony meets Slipknot's Ira meets absolute chaos and destruction vibe of the album, I just didn't really care for the majority of the songs. Most of the songs were pretty short and felt more like interludes than actual tracks, which makes sense because this is very obviously an album that is supposed to be listened to in full, but it just didn't make me want to listen to it in full. That was at least before I listened to the album again before making this video and fell absolutely in love with it. It's no Zone, that's for sure, but it's still a very good record that grew on me a lot. From a band that couldn't quite reach the heights of their previous album, to one that made one of the biggest jumps in quality I have ever seen. My 9th favorite album of the year was Grayscale Season's Do You Like Violence. From the very first song on Do You Like Violence on, it's pretty clear that this is not your usual metalcore record. It's a ride, an emotional rollercoaster between ethereal, almost heavily cleans and these super violent outbursts of heaviness all over the record. It's a record that shines in both heavy and soft, but especially whenever both are combined. I've always found myself drawn to metalcore that combines both the heavier and the softer aspects of the genre, and very rarely does a band utilize both to such extremes as Grayscale Season or Do You Like Violence. This is definitely an album that wasn't on my radar coming into 2022, but I'm super happy I gave it a chance, and it's no surprise that it ended up my 9th favorite album of the year considering just how good it is. One of the records I was most excited for coming into the year was 156 Silent's Narrative, and, well, they absolutely delivered. 156 Silent as a band have always stood for super angry and super anxious metalcore with new influences, and this is exactly what we got on the new record. The moment you hit play, you are sucked into a world of darkness and despair, supported by ruthless breakdowns and these kind of spoken word screams that oftentimes resemble a kind of super pissed off poetry. The guitars themselves are often in the background and let the vocals and even the bass run the show, but whenever they do get their time in the spotlight, it is absolutely glorious, like in this part for example. I agree with some of the complaints that I read online that this album can get a little repetitive and even sameish towards the end, but I think that this is very much done on purpose because, as the album title already suggests, this is a narrative and it feels like all the songs are connected some way or the other. Narrative as an album is a haunting experience and I fell in love with it and think that every single one of you out there who is at least somewhat into darker sounding metalcore should experience this album at least once. Now that Parkway Dive and Architects are gone for good, there's room for new metalcore frontrunners, and who would be better suited to fill these shoes than Bleed From Within? I think we all knew that Bleed From Within had it in them to become one of metalcore's flagships, and the biggest surprise was just how long it took, not that it actually happened. Shrine is Bleed From Within's 4th album, and it honestly just takes everything that made its predecessor so good and amplifies it by 100. The riffs are amazing, the vocals are amazing, the production is amazing, and they even added some orchestra and string stuff like in Levitate, and it works incredibly well. When it comes to pure metalcore, without any further bric-a-brac, no one really does it better than Bleed From Within at the moment, and so Shrine ended up my 7th favorite album of the year. If I had to describe Northlane's Obsidian in a single word, that word would be polarizing. People seem to either love it or hate it, with only a small minority in between the two opinions. And I get it, this is probably the farthest a band can stray away from metalcore, while still being considered to be at least somewhat metalcore, and I'm already using the word somewhat quite lenient here. It was a pretty bold move from them to double down on the techno and new influences that were already pretty prevalent on their widely acclaimed Alien, and I'm not surprised it isn't working for everyone. While Alien was all over the place with its various influences, but at the very core still a metalcore record, This album just feels like it's Linkin Park techno with a Matrix aesthetic. I don't love all of the record, but the things that work for me just work so damn well. Overall, I feel like I liked the album a little bit more with every replay I gave it, and so in the end it grew to a solid 5th place. If I had to title the Metalcore 2020 so far, I would title them the years of revival core. More and more bands go back to an early 2000s style of metalcore, and for me, one band that stands out from the bunch are Boundaries. Their 2022 record, Burying Brightness, is an ode to old school, riffy, brutal caveman metalcore. But it's also so much more than that, because hidden beneath all the breakdowns and riffs is one of the most emotional metalcore albums of the year. The lyrics range from hard-hitting to heartbreaking, and there's even some signature Boundaries passages where the Matt just talking super depressive stuff for an extended period of time. New to their sound is the addition of cleans that are sprinkled all over the record, and whenever those cleans do hit, it becomes absolutely gut-wrenching. I mean, just listen to this.
Enough to make a grown man cry.
Overall, I think that this is an incredible record, and if you haven't listened to Boundaries yet, you should do so, because I promise you that you won't regret it. I'm just going to say it. I think that Scars for You to Remember is an amazing record, and I have no idea why you all are hating on it. It sounds like the logical evolution of In Darkness, but it still goes hard as fuck. The overall atmosphere with all the samples and interludes works great for me, and whenever the album isn't atmospheric, it really makes me want to smash my furniture to bits. Mitch does an amazing job on the vocals, and here comes another unpopular opinion. I like his vocals more than Travis's because of the sheer dynamic they have. The way he flexes over those new hardcore type instrumentals is just so satisfying to me. There definitely is a point to be made about the production of the record, and I agree that it sounds artificial and even straight up flat in some parts, but I really don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. It's one of the only flaws I can see with this record that I fell in love with immediately upon its release and still can't get enough of. For me personally, Eulogy for Those Still Here is the first Counterparts record to not top its predecessor, but it's still easily one of the best metalcore records of the year. It's signature Counterparts, but at the same time it's the furthest they've strayed away from their sound yet, with Brenton bringing in a lot more diversity and range in his vocals and even doing quite a lot of singing. It's also their most emotional record to date, and you can tell that most of it, especially the lyrics, come from a really dark place. Brenton is most definitely one of the best writers of lyrics in the entire scene, and Whispers of Your Death, a song about a cat of all things, is one of the most gut-wrenching things I've ever heard, and I'm not alone with it. The whole album hits super close to home, but never loses the energy and catchiness that one immediately thinks about when thinking about Counterparts. Personally, I still prefer Nothing Left to Love over this one, just because it's one of my favorite records of all time, but I can definitely see why most Counterparts fans regard this as their best work to date. It's always pretty impressive when, after listening to pretty much every bigger metalcore release of the year, a release from a smaller band ends up as one of my favorites. But it's even more impressive when that release comes from a band that has less than 1,000 listeners on Spotify and is actually their very first album. Hrfdr released an album called Specter in 2022, and it was not only my second favorite album of the year, but also my most listened to album of the year, and is easily one of the best debut albums I've ever heard from a metalcore band. It's pretty hard to describe the sound of this album, but I'd say it sits somewhere between newcore and progressive metalcore, with some pretty clear Thal influences. It has this thick, dark ambience and a guitar tone that is so big, huge, and industrial sounding that it makes you feel like you're in this huge factory and all around you are working machines. It always reminds me of that SpongeBob episode in which SpongeBob finds out that Mr. Krabs has this evil factory in which he exploits jellyfish for their jelly, because the album honestly just sounds like it. Another thing that continues to impress me about the record is the production and the mix. Especially newer bands often have not so good mixes, but the mix on Specter is perfect and it works amazing with their sound. I couldn't find out who mixed and produced the record, but I'd happily let them do both for all of my favorite bands' record in the future. That's just so much I love the sound of this record. I hope I was able to convince you to close this video and open Spotify ASAP, because this band and this album are amazing and they deserve every little bit of attention they can get. When Ocean's 8 Alaska dropped their single Metamorph in 2020, I was head over heels with the idea of them dropping a complete album in that style. I had never heard metalcore with lo-fi influences before, and Metamorph immediately became my favorite Ocean's 8 Alaska song of all time. What followed, however, was one of the worst album releases I've ever seen. It took 2 years until the next 2 singles were released. One of them was barely longer than an interlude, and both of them were not representative of the album style at all. Afterwards, the album was announced just 2 weeks ahead of its release with barely any marketing and no hype surrounding it. Needless to say, I was more than worried about the record that I had waited for so long. Luckily, all these worries disappeared upon my first listening of Disparity, because honestly, this album is absolutely amazing. Other than the 2 previous singles suggested, this actually was the lo-fi metalcore that I had so eagerly hoped for, and it was much, much better than I had expected. The lo-fi elements and Ocean's 8 Alaska's signature technical fuckery work so well with each other. It really does sound like the 2 genres were made for each other. I mean, listen to this. Does this sound like 2 different genres that couldn't be further from each other to you? There's really only one thing to complain about with Disparity for me, and that is that the heavier songs don't really do it for me. I really like the earlier and heavier style of the band, but the heavy songs on Disparity just don't have the same magic that the songs on Lost Isles, for example, had. That being said, this is only a minor complaint, and I don't really feel the need to skip these songs or anything. I just don't like them as much as the rest of the album. In the end, Ocean's 8 Alaska's Disparity was my favorite album of the year, and I've never been happier to have been proven wrong by a band. Thank you so much for listening to me nerding the fuck out about my favorite albums and bands. And as always, if you want to add anything or have a different opinion, feel free to comment below. See you around.